So I'm going to go ahead and get it started. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm David E. Kirkland, the Vice Dean for Equity, Belonging, and Community Action at the NYU Steinert School. We're also serve as the Executive Director of NYU Metro Center and Professor of Urban Education. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I want to acknowledge that I'm sitting on Lenape land. I welcome you to a conversation on disability justice that recognizes the importance of race and power. To begin, we should acknowledge that the social constructions of both race and disability are products of the project of white supremacy. Individuals who are identified as race are positioned as less than within a system founded on whiteness. Likewise, individuals with disabilities have been identified first by eugenicists and even still by medical scientists as being undesirable. From the Western eugenics movement all the way up through organizations that seek to end disabilities such as autism and Down syndrome, disability has been positioned not only as abnormal, but undesirable and worthy of extinction in society. The history of people who are marked as race is distinct from those who are marked as disabled, but to be sure, these experiences can and often do overlap. And what scholarship shows is that bodies marked simultaneously as both race and disabled are uniquely positioned within American education for separation, seclusion, and segregation. Students at the farthest margins from normality have been placed in the most adverse educational environments as their variations from that normality become more at odds with the preservation of opportunities for those with historically privileged identities. In this space, disability functions like race, and race is constructed as a disability. But too often, our conversations on race or ability omit the other to our collective peril. In today's conversation, I want to respond to the idea that so much of disability justice has been positioned and premised on white property. That is, for whites only. We saw it in the concerns of white women dominating the feminist movement. We saw it when the labor movement became essentially about the concerns of working class white men, and of course I can go on. My hope is that today's conversation will help us begin to frame an intersectional critical race conversation on disability justice. We have to be intentional about exposing, white centralities that impose themselves on justice movements. We have to be intentional about posing questions, especially with respect to disability justice, of how does race matter? Joining me today, I'd like to introduce two amazing colleagues and friends. Can I call y'all friends? Friends of mine. Dr. Subini Annamma, excuse me if I butchered it, is on the faculty at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University. Her groundbreaking work critically examines the way students are criminalized and resist that criminalization through the mutually constitutive nature of racism and ableism, how they interlock with other marginalizing oppressions, and how these intersections impact youth education trajectories in urban schools and youth prisons. She is the leading voice linking the movements for disability justice to movements for racial justice. A pioneer of Discrete theory, I'm honored to share the stage and to share space with my friend, Subini. Dr. Alfredoo Artiles is the Lee Jacks Professor of Education at the Graduate School of Education, also at Stanford. His scholarship examines the dual nature of disability as an object of protection and a tool for stratification. More specifically, he has sought to understand how responses to disability as they intersect with race, social class, and language advance or hinder educational opportunities for disparate groups of students. Alfredoo is also a superstar, a pioneer in his own right, a trailblazer in disability studies. Please join me in welcoming my friend Alfredoo Artiles to the stage. Now, Subini and Alfredoo, Today's conversation is meant to be informal and intimate, absent the pretension and performance of too many spaces like this one. So I'll just ask questions, perhaps join in the conversation with a few comments of my own. I promise to hold my commentary to a minimum, though. But I want you two to feel free to answer like you want. Take the conversation where you think it needs to go, and we will proceed organically. After we've talked, I'll take questions from the audience. Audience members, please use the Q&A feature on Zoom to share your questions. Also, we need your energy. So please use the chat to be in conversation and community with one another. Now, Subini and Alfredoo, after we've addressed audience questions, I'll give you both a few minutes for closing comments before I wrap things up. Does this work for you? Outstanding. Great. So let's begin the conversation, right? Am I making too much of this? Right? This idea that we need a critical race conversation about ability justice in order to have a conversation that's truly about disability justice. What role should race play in disability justice? And I'll let either of you respond.
Go ahead, Subini, please.
Thank you. I want to just start before I answer your question to say thank you to Paloma from the Metro Center for dreaming the foundation of our discussion, for organizing the logistics, and for inviting me to be in conversation with both David and Alfredoo, and both of whose work has laid the foundation for my own. Honestly, Discrete would not exist without the work of Alfredoo Artiles in particular, but also without the work of David Kirkland. So thank you to you both as for being in this conversation with me today. I want to thank the interpreters for adding accessibility and the accessibility you create. Thank you for that. I also want to recognize that San Francisco is on the unceded lands of the Ramaytush Ohlone people who are still here to this day. And I also want to recognize the ongoing anti-Asian violence that has killed and harmed Asian women, including those murdered in Atlanta and Indianapolis, the ongoing anti-Black violence that has harmed countless Black folks, and finally recognizing how our Black and brown youth are not protected, the police killings of Adam Toledo, Anthony Thompson Jr., and Ma'Khia Bryant, recognizing what Ruthie Wilson Gilmore calls the death-dealing violence of racism being borne by groups who don't serve the white supremacist patriarchal status quo. So David, your question is really important for multiple reasons, but I want to really be clear about the difference between disability studies and disability justice, right? Disability studies is something that the Academy does. Disability justice is grown from a lineage of activism, from groups and individuals, including Sins Invalid, Patty Byrne, Leroy Moore, Keith Jones, T.L. Lewis, Dustin Gibson, Lydia Brown, and more. So the reason I want to make sure we understand the
Subini just cut out. So Alfredoo, while we wait for Subini to reconnect, why don't you tackle the question? And I get what you're saying, that there's Subini, you cut out, and I was just talking to Alfredoo, but we can let you go ahead and continue.
Yeah, sorry about that. My internet, Zoom life from home. But really, I just wanted to clarify that, disability justice was not born in the academy, and academics need to be cautious and thoughtful when we're engaging it and be able to talk about the distinctions. Sins Invalid in particular has 10 principles that they call disability justice. And so I want us to just always be grappling with that. But really, the point is for me, and what Alfredoo's work has shed such a light on, is that racism and ableism are intertwined. They are interdependent. You don't do one without the other. And so if people understand that if racism is how we've decided to rank people by race, ableism is how the ranking is engaged, right? So by positioning Black and brown folks automatically as less intelligent, as less able to control their behavior. That is how ableism and racism work together. And so I want us to always be thinking about that because we can't do one without the other. Much racial justice work, including anti-racist work, social justice, abolitionist, all of that is so, so important. And it often leaves disability out. It leaves people with disabilities out, but it also leaves ableism out. And I want us to have a stronger analytic focus if we actually include racism and ableism as interdependent. And and a great example of that, right? Historically, that has started all the way back in time. So, you know, in the founding of our country, when slavery, when people were still being enslaved, right? There was a psychological diagnosis called drapetomania, right? And that is when slaves run away. They made that a psychological diagnosis. So we immediately see historically how ableism and racism were built to lock out certain people from the properties of whiteness and to rein in people who refused to obey the rules, and how Black and brown bodies were refused to obey the rules. And again, we can see this across time with many racial groups. We saw how the Chinese Exclusion Act excluded Chinese folks and situated them as more likely to use drugs, right? The indigenous boarding schools, how you had to, as one colonel said at one point, you have to kill the Indian to save the man, right? So we've seen this historically throughout time, and this goes all the way into today with how we see Black and brown folks disabled folks being more likely to be killed by police, Black and brown folks being over-labeled with disabilities in schools. So lots of ways those are connected. So I know I'm going on and on, so I want Alfredo to get a chance to answer too.
No, I love it. I love it. Please feel free. I mean, this conversation is going to be free flowing and organic. And, you know, this is a space where we're learning so much. So thank you. Alfredo.
Yes, thank you, Subini and David, for the question. And thank you, Subini, for your generous acknowledgement of how we are building on what has come before us. That's something that is so critical for the work we do as educators and scholars, because we're always building and enriching what has been done in the past. We owe it to many people. We never make it alone. And before I go on, I just want to thank you, David, for the introduction and your leadership over the years. And of course, gracias also to the Metro Center and NYU for hosting us today. I joined Subini in sending a shout out to Paloma Garcia for her support. And this is a timely conversation. I was telling you before we started, David, particularly at this time in the history of this nation. I hope everybody's taking care of themselves and their loved ones, given what we have been living for the last year and a half or so. It's been, as Darren Walker said, a season of suffering, not only because of the pandemic, but also the racial intolerance that Subini alluded to, particularly targeting African Americans and Asian American Pacific Islanders. You know, disability justice is an important point. It's a long-standing issue. I appreciate Subini's distinction between what happens in the academy versus what's happening in society and communities. It's a problem that for sure compels us to reflect about how we conceptualize equity and think about justice. But the bottom line is, it really compels us to answer the question, how do we avoid dehumanizing those whom we are seeking to work with and serving? And by asking the question, we are really reminding ourselves that what we do is not only a technical enterprise. It has that deep moral dimension. And that moral dimension should be at the forefront. This is something that we don't hear much in teacher education or doctoral preparation. In fact, people confuse the call for objectivity in the work we do as professionals and researchers with a detachment from moral and ethical questions. So I think it is a critical reminder that this is about those issues as well. Your question, I agree with Subini completely, that it's about bringing what I describe as a historical epistemology to the work we do. When we look at the record, as Subini was already suggesting, we have seen that entanglement of race and disability present for a long time. not only we think about disability as a concept that can justify discrimination, we have plenty of evidence of how we discriminated people with disabilities, but also have used that idea to justify also racial injustices to racial groups, racialized groups. Many people in special education call 1968 the beginning of discussions about the racialization of disability because of Lloyd Dawn's article in a journal. It's a little short-sighted because if we think about it, all the way back to the 18th century, we already have a record in things like the ugly laws that have been controlling who could be seen in public spaces and how they should be behaving in context of community activities and the workplace. The ugly laws actually affected, interestingly enough, a lot of people with disabilities, but also racialized bodies, especially Black bodies. And those laws peaked in the late 1800s, just when racial segregation was the law in large portions of the South. Immigration laws were doing the same thing for people with mental and physical defects, and the eugenics movement was doing the same. So it's not coincidence that those forms of ability differences were very much entwined with racial differences. And the key is, how do we begin to recover attention to this social historical structure in what we do in education, practice, and research? Patricia Hill Collins said recently, we have erased social structure from the work that we do in the academy, but also in political and popular discourse. So back to your question, it's all about history.
I want to get back to both history and law, because I think it's about history, but it's also about law and precedent. I want to get to that in a second, but Subini raises a question about this notion, this concept of whiteness as property, and I want to just get some operational definitions for some of these concepts for our audience, and I have a question that's related to it. So first, if both of you, or if one of you, if not both of you, if you can define for us, what is whiteness as property?
Since I brought it up, I'll start, and then I would love to hear. So first of all, I forgot at the beginning, though it's in the chat, I encourage everyone, one of the ways, I like what David is doing here, stopping and asking us to operationalize the words we use. As academics, we tend to use big words and assume we all have the same assumption and training and even just belief in what they are. But as we're seeing things like critical race theory being taken up in the news in such profoundly problematic ways, anything that people don't like right now is being described as critical race theory. And as somebody who does disability critical race theory, I obviously root myself in critical race theory, and I'm just so firmly insulted because y'all, what they're claiming critical race theory is, that ain't it, right? That ain't it. But also, I appreciate that you're encouraging us to define what we're talking about, because again, that brings us out of the academy and into like a conversation that's more accessible to more people. So part of accessibility is not only sign language interpreters and captioning, both of which are so important, but it's also making sure that we define what we're talking about and making it accessible in that way. So, and also, by the way, if you want to tag us on Twitter, another way I think we make our conversations less elitist is putting them into the public domain. So having webinars like this, including conversations on Twitter, all of that stuff is recognizing as knowledge generation and not just our fancy papers that are in journals that nobody can read because nobody can afford behind paywalls. So thank you for all that. So whiteness is property, to me, based on Cheryl Harris's definition and original writing around it, is the idea of securing whiteness as a way to secure property rights. And that means securing the right to exclude. So to bounding the property right of the boundaries of whiteness, tightening them so less and less people can enter them. So that is how whiteness is property, because once you are seen, whiteness is property, once you are seen as white, you get all of these extra benefits, right? So it originally, only white people could own land, right? And so that was where, but now whiteness has become where you get all these other social benefits. So the social benefits of smartness, So Zeus Leonardo and Alicia Broderick wrote a beautiful piece called Smartness as Property, where they saw smartness being locked in by whiteness and so really limiting who could be seen as smart. Right. And we see again this play out. Who gets into gifted and talented? We see it in the New York City schools and who gets into the select schools. We just saw this in San Francisco because they finally got rid of the admissions criteria for Lowell High School, one of our real high performing high schools that really limited the access for Black and Brown youth to get into. So for me, whiteness as property is understanding that being defined as white is so powerful that folks want to exclude everyone else from getting access to that boundary of whiteness. So that's what I mean by whiteness as property. Alfredo, did you want to add anything? I want to make sure that.
No, that was beautiful. And, I just want to stress the role that whiteness as property plays in ensuring privileges for the white race that is inscribed in the law, back to David's point, that this is not only about an ideology and people's beliefs, it is perpetuated through the encoding of these ideas in the law. That to this day, as you just suggested, Subini, is well and alive. The struggle over affirmative action is a beautiful example of how this is played out as well. So I don't have much to add to that.
Well, I love how you all are on my question sheet, just all on the question sheet, just going around answering, all the things that I have. So Alfredo, to follow up right now. So now that we've operationalized, some parts of the conversation, I like to ask, can you all help us begin to recognize how both whiteness is property, or whiteness and ability function as property, and how gains for people labeled with disabilities have largely been made as a result of interest convergence of white middle-class citizens or white middle-class identities. Basically, how has this framed the disability movement in some parts, right? Like around the interest convergence of, white middle-class identified people based on this concept that, you all have laid out as whiteness, ability, functioning as property.
We have to remember that disability has these two facets. We have engaged with it as a way of protecting groups. That tends to be a racialized response. So families, communities, societies, the states, resources are mobilized, programs are created, professionals are prepared, and many benefits ensue from that in many cases. However, we have seen people using this idea of disability to stratify and segregate, and that's what's been happening under the discussion of the racialization of disabilities. And when you look at how we have used disability as a tool of exclusion and segregation, we see the tropes of whiteness and the conflation of disability with race that has been with us for a long time really continuing to be alive. A lot of the discussions, if you follow the debate going on around race and disability, especially in the last 12 years, when researchers are now going back to the idea that there is not a problem, that race doesn't matter. The same key premises are there, well and alive. There is a clear deficit orientation that the reality is they argue that these groups tend to be overrepresented, racialized groups, students of color, come from communities in which there are more risks in their health and in their well-being. And not surprisingly, some of these people claim they should be placed in larger numbers. So this idea that being brown or Black, it means lacking, that you are coming from damaged communities. And the solution is this intervention called special education, is continued to be used in funding decisions, in policy decisions. But more troublingly, I see the biological reinscription of race and disability. The argument goes that because of poverty, many of these kids are born with very low birth weight. They're exposed to lead. They're exposed to toxic stress. They have chronic exposure to multiple risk factors. And then being a member of a particular race becomes synonym with being damaged, with assuming that there are biological inherent characteristics of these communities. And that produces what I call this ideology ontology circuits, that we make assumptions based on this ideology of damaged communities about these groups as being the essential feature that defines them. And that creates a circle of repetition over and over. And if these interventions were to provide some support for these kids in their education, the evidence is lacking. And you've been writing about this, David, in terms of the experience and the processes. I call it, I approach it from the idea of consequential validities of our decisions. If the promised land is diagnosis and service in those specialized programs, are we delivering? And what we find is troubling, because African Americans tend to be placed in more segregated programs than their white peers with the same disability. They tend to get fewer resources in terms of related services than their white peers with disabilities. So it's troubling to see this biological reinscription of race that perpetuates the deficit orientation, and then the continuing use of metrics that are completely decontextualized and acritical to say that low academic achievement means among students of color that they probably have disability. It's really leaving out any considerations about the multi-generational lack of opportunity and discrimination that communities and kids have faced. So let me stop there.
So in some ways, Alfredo, what I hear you saying is that, there is a disability problem when it comes to, delivering services, or at least understanding how to respond to, those who are disabled, coded by race. So if you're Black, you're more likely to be punished. If you have a disability, if you're Black and you're male, and increasingly Monique Moore's Subini's work has shown us, if you're Black and you're a woman, you're also more likely to be punished. But also, if you're Black, you're more likely to be labeled with a disability in order to be pushed into that moment or to that space of punishment, even if you may not have a disability.
Indeed.
Subini.
Right, and I would just add to that. So I want us to both grapple with both things, right? The fact that we have overrepresentation of Black and brown youth in particularly in certain disability categories, especially emotional disabilities, right, is so concerning. But I also want us to recognize the problematic things that happen in special education, and that if we had perfect proportionality, that is, if we had 14% of Black kids in the school and 14% of Black kids in special ed, that still wouldn't mean that the quality of education that they are getting is the same. And that's my concern. Sometimes when we get into a focus on overrepresentation, we miss the fact that special ed services are not delivering the outcomes for Black youth that we want them to be. And so we also need, so yes, we need to examine overrepresentation. I will never say ignore that. But my concern is that that hyper focus has been about better diagnosing kids. And it's ignored the fact that Black youth are not graduating at the rates, Black youth with disabilities are not graduating at the same rates. They're more likely to be pushed out. They're more likely to be arrested. They're more likely to put in youth prisons. So if we really want to fix it, yes, it's fixing overrepresentation, but it's also fixing special education. What is happening that we are delivering special education as it is all to white children? So what I mean by that is, as soon as disability comes into the conversation, it seems some people see it as then wiping out all other demographic factors, as if race, as if gender, as if those things don't matter. So even in school districts where they're doing these great anti-racist work, they're having ethnic studies, all this stuff, I'll often go in and say, okay, great. So what's happening in this special ed classroom? Where is their anti-racist work? Oh, they don't need that. They need remedial education. They don't need that. They need this. They need to learn their ABCs. They need to learn number placement. They need to learn these things. So suddenly we don't need culturally sustaining work in special education because they're no longer Black. That ain't it, right? So like, what is happening? So I just want us to continually hold on to both things. because I think both things really, really matter here. And it concerns me that a lot of times, even in Black communities, when I start talking about these things, the focus on overrepresentation actually kind of, when I say, well, what is happening in special ed? Well, that's their business. Those kids are disabled. They're not our kids. No, son, they're all our kids. They're all our kids, and they all deserve a high quality education. And if you're in high school and you're a Black kid with a disability reading about Sassy the Seal because you need to learn your S sounds, like really, like that's, we're saying that's going to get us free, because I don't think that's going to do it.
I love it. I love it. So, I mean, we've said some things, right? One thing that we said, in talking about U.S. education, in the ways that U.S. education preserve whiteness and ability, right? How special education becomes a part of that project, right? We've talked a little bit about the ways that special education, while providing the structures and services to support a population historically excluded from education, also provides structures and mechanisms to continue the eugenics project of deeming certain bodies unfit for education and as a matter of out of place within traditional classrooms and schools. Let's stay there. Let's stay on special education. So special education, has historically, become such a problem, right? A space where culturally responsive or culturally sustaining education, does not exist. Not that you said it cannot exist, but does not exist. If special education has become this place where we burden bodies of color with punishment, right? Given the original, kind of intention of special education, as I understand it, like a supposed intervention to provide the supplemental needs so that education can work and be designed in a more equitable manner. How can special education work in order for us to, re-understand this conversation, this intersection between race and disability? Can special education be part of a solution?
I will say maybe. I think we need responses to students with disabilities. The challenge is, how do we avoid falling in the traps of what we have seen in the history of special education? We have seen developments around inclusive education that is also problematic in a number of ways, because it's lacking attention to all of the things we've been mentioned in terms of social justice and inequality and attention to race. A big part of the problem is building on what Subini was saying earlier, that the whole discussion and analysis and self-critique of the field seems to be refusing to acknowledge that this is a broader problem. This is not an issue of technical accuracy. This is not about diagnostic precision. We need to build the technologies to help us understand better the multidimensional needs and assets of kids. But when you hear researchers saying, if you compare groups among otherwise similar students, well, can we really say that the experience of an African American or Latinx student is otherwise similar to a white student, even if you have all the controls on social class and location of residence, et cetera? Given the history of racial stratification in the United States, can we really find that beyond being a statistical strategy? That's the problem, that we refuse to bring to the analysis of these issues the role that those stratification forces have in what we do in education. So a lot of the research that we have seen and policy remedies ignore completely. It is as if we are living and working in a field that is completely devoid of all of those things. A happy place where racism and sexism and classism don't exist for some magical reason. So that is the first change that we need to see, to have a special education, or whatever we call it, being attentive and grounded in an understanding of how people live in societies and how certain groups have very different opportunities to achieve and to get access to resources. The second thing is the fact that the research knowledge that is being funded and produced is completely colorblind or color evasive. And that means we need to begin to prepare the next generation of researchers in ways that are more attentive to some of these stratifying forces, in ways that are productive for the learning theories and teaching technologies we develop, which is not something easy, but it's happening. The learning sciences are beginning to show that you can integrate learning with race and other markers of difference and oppression in systematic ways. So it's a big job, David. I mean, talking about how you produce knowledge in new ways is a tall order.
Subini, I want to give you time.
Yeah, I would just, I mean, echo everything Alfredo's already said in the sense that can special ed be part of this project of bringing us closer to an anti-racist kind of education? And I think it could be, but it's got to really be rethought. I think education really needs to be rethought. The problem is that we have to ask questions about general ed and then special ed as if they're two different things. And right now, that's how they are built to be. They're built to be two structures that have very little relationship with each other. We take a kid from here, once we decide that this child is too unruly for whatever reason and learning and behavior, and then we decide we send them somewhere and they're no longer a problem. And then this group says, we're gonna fix that brokenness in you. And so even those two assumptions are completely problematic and not going to get us free, right? And so what I want us to continually think about, and what some of the activists I mentioned earlier is like, what do we need? And what would it look like if we abolished schooling the way it is currently set up and reimagined education? So it's not about, I want inclusion altogether, because again, inclusive education, if we think of inclusion as simply a spatial arrangement, we've seen how that plays out, right? We get the kids with disabilities go in the back with their para and they never actually talk to any of the kids, right? Or we end up seeing that, one of my students did a study where the girl with in the wheelchair has to sit down here while the choir is all up here, because but hey, she's included, right? She's included, she's there. But that's not what, right? And that's such a superficial, and again, a spatial arrangement of inclusion, but that's not a theoretical engagement with it. So I think that's, again, theory and practice have to work together. And that's why, we can't be all up here in the theory, but we can't just pretend the practice can work without theory either. And so if we understand, racism is endemic, right? Like that's something that that critical race theory, that's our first tenet, is that racism is real, it exists, it is normal, it is everyday stuff, and it is not going anywhere, right? That's that racial realism Derek Bell talks about. So if we know that, then we don't have to run around asking, is this person racist? Is this person racist? Is our country racist? Is this, we don't have to ask those kind of silly questions, because all we know, racism is built into the systems of our country. And instead we can ask different questions. So I don't need to ask, is special education racist? I need to ask, how are we going to reimagine special education to meet the needs of our kids? How are we going to reimagine general education to meet the needs of our kids? And that's a different question to me. It's much more productive.
I love the shade. I just love the shade, Subini. On Paul Morgan's work, he had a piece in the New York Times that asks, is special education racist? And the conclusion is it's not. It's actually working. And his argument is that more Black and brown kids should be remediated and placed in special education or labeled. I love it. And if you haven't checked out, that work, I advise you not to. You're not going to get much out of it. I'm throwing shade too now. I want to move the conversation, right? This conversation around race and disability, because special education is just one place where this conversation of race and ability works out. Let's pick on gifted education. How does this conversation, helps us to understand, gives us a framework to interpret the national conversation that we're having about gifted education in the ways that it reinforces segregation, seclusion, white supremacy, whiteness as property, and some of the other things that we've talked about. What role does giftedness and gifted education play in disability justice?
I mean, for me, gifted education is the ultimate example of whiteness as property. It is locking in the right to advanced, accelerated, and sometimes just decent teaching for a very select amount of children, and most of them are white, right? And then, it's really similar to, and it's another form of ableism, right? Like, and that's what I want us to understand is, just like the model minority myth, that mainly East Asian and sometimes some Southeast Asian folks are subject to, and we pretend that it's some like exceptional compliment, when really the model minority myth is so harmful to Asian communities. And it's created situations where where Asian folks are fighting affirmative action because we've become invested. Some of us have become invested in the idea of being seen as the model minority, right? And so absolutely, like, gifted and all of that, again, and if you really look at it, like in Kansas, where I just came from, gifted education falls under special education, which is really interesting because because it's basically, again, about a spatial arrangement that says you are too different from the center middle to be taught here. You are too high above or too high below of the center middle to be taught in this general education class. And like, what does that mean? That we have decided you're so super smart, you also don't get to be taught here, or you're so super low that you don't get to be taught here. It's just, it's again, restricting and tightening the bounds of who gets access to quality education. So that's really how I see giftedness. I know other people don't see it that way. And I know, like, people get mad when I say this, but I really don't see gifted serving any other purpose but retaining particular property rights and benefits.
And we should remember that the idea of intelligence is at the center of gifted education. You know, you have to get, among other things, measures of intelligence. And in many contexts, is a defining consideration for people to, it shouldn't be, but it tends to be used that way. And when there is a long legacy of research questioning the cultural validity of the notion of intelligence and how we operationalize it to examine it and test it, starting in the 20th century, the way it was used to classify and group people for different purposes and give them more or less access to resources. And not surprisingly, social class and race played dominant roles in deciding who was and was not gifted. So back to the historical dimension, I think it's important to realize that it is to some extent culturally arbitrary to decide who is gifted, who decides what counts as gifted behavior or profiles. And when you have technologies like giftedness or intelligence or disability, we develop tools and artifacts to decide who fits that profile. And what we tend to forget is that people appropriate and make use of those tools and resources in very unique ways, oftentimes with gains around power and privilege. And this is a pattern that has been replicated across geographical regions. We did a study on inclusive education and found out that many countries in the global north and the global south were using the idea of inclusive education. Back to Subini's earlier point about being a place, it was not supposed to be a place, supposed to be a restructuring of systems. Yet 10, 11 nations in that project we had consistently were using the idea of inclusive education to segregate different groups. In Spain, the Gypsies and the Moroccans. In Sweden, the African immigrants. In England, the Pakistanis. In Austria, the Roma. In every society, we found evidence that this idea, again, how we use these ideas and tools, ended up constructing or reifying old standing inequity.
Thank you for that. I wanna just sink this point, Alfredo, because you've made it, and you've made it, you know, kind of quite well, right? You talked about the arbitrariness of things like ability and race. It's not that they don't exist, but it's that, you know, something happens in order for them to exist, right? You know, can you unpack, either you or both of you, unpack the social constructions of race and ability, right? I know you've been doing that, but I just want to put a you know, kind of like a button, a pin on this conversation. Can you unpack the social constructions of, you know, race and ability and help us understand the material and psychological impacts of being labeled as both race and disabled?
Go for it, Subini.
Thanks. I mean, I think part of it, right, is both understanding, again, how disability has been conceived through whiteness, to understand how race and disability are socially constructed. Because part of what I want us to understand is, when we think of the disabled person, often that disabled person is a white disabled person. And so even when people of color have disabilities, they're not considered or they're not thought of, or because they don't identify as disabled. And then we get this whole, the white disability kind of shaming the community, shaming them because they don't identify as disabled. Well, to identify as disabled as a Black person could get you killed at different points in right? Like in slavery, like you were not safe if you were disabled. You were seen as less valuable property. And I'm putting air quotes around in case you can't, but so understanding that is a huge part of this, but also the material realities of being socially constructed as disabled for a person of color are different than it is for being a white disabled person. And so again, we have this overrepresentation. But we also have, it's not just in special ed, right? The overrepresentation of Black and brown youth with disabilities in youth prisons is something we have to start talking about. That we have decided to dispose of what we consider difficult kids in particular places. And if anyone wants to know, because I work in youth prisons with kids with disabilities, many who have disabilities coming in, but also gain disabilities by being there, because those places are so traumatic, because youth prisons are full of sexual and gendered violence. And to give you one example of that, right? I work in carceral spaces. I do research in carceral spaces. Most of those places that I've been in, especially the maximum security ones, kids are required to have an education, right? So they have to go to school. That is a requirement. So they are forced to walk from their cells, go to a school, whatever that school classroom might be, a separate building, might not. They have to go to there. But also then they are constantly under the threat of violence. So for example, if a pencil goes missing, usually you have a pencil, you have a block, you keep 12 pencils in or however many pencils, and you count them before and after every class. And if a pencil goes missing, guess what? Strip search. So what happens when tools of learning are considered considered weapons? And those tools of learning, if you lose one, you are literally at risk for gendered and sexual violence. So when we talk about material realities, I don't want us to stop with overrepresentation, though that in itself again is serious, but I want us to take it all the way to where we dispose of kids and what we do with them. So that's the material realities of being labeled as Black and disabled in this country as a child. That you are more likely to end up in a place where you can get strip searched for losing a pencil. And if any of us are comfortable with that, we got to sit with that. And one of the easiest things I think we could be doing, if those of us who are thinking about abolition, who are trying to figure out what that means for education, who are really jumping on this bandwagon, and I don't mean that in a bad way. I want us to jump on the bandwagon of abolition, but I want us to think about what that means. The easiest thing we could be doing right now is fighting for the closure of youth prisons. They do not show to have positive outcomes. They do not show to do the thing to rehabilitate kids. They do not increase education outcomes, employment outcomes, mental health outcomes. They get kids locked in the cycle of a legal system that does not care about them. So I think one of the things we have to think about is that's what I mean when I talk about, yes, race and disability are both social constructions. They are made up things, just like everything is made as a social construction. They are made up things, but we have attached so much value to them as a society that these material realities are harming our children. They're harming our babies.
Love it.
So I think I don't have much to add. I think those are compelling points. At the root of your question, David, is the notion of social construction. And when I have discussions in different circles about this idea of social construction, many people have a very strong reaction to say, how can you say disability is a social construction when it is real? It has that material dimension that Subini was alluding to. And to say that something is a social construction doesn't mean that it does not exist. It doesn't mean that it's made up out of air. I mean, there is a material dimension to having disability, more so in certain areas than others, physical, sensory, etc. However, to me, what the idea of social construction invokes is the fact that in order to use that term, in this case, disability, requires a set of shared understandings and assumptions, and a share of cultural practices, that notion is based in a cultural dimension, so that disability is not necessarily the issue with my brain, or my ability to process language, or my ability to speak or walk. It means that I need to understand that aspect of disability in the context of the situations in which I am functioning and living. It takes a lot of people to construct disability in terms of how we respond or not, in terms of the consequences, and in terms of the outcomes we see down the road as we bring presumably interventions to that, as Subini was saying before. So I think the question for me is at the end, how, by whom, under what conditions, and to what ends these categories that are symbolic, like disability, are made real in the lives of individuals. And I'm paraphrasing Ruha Benjamin's discussion of race and technology. So how, by whom, under what conditions, and to what ends those symbolic categories become real, and what are the consequences that are applied to that? That's the question for the research community and for us in the education field, to understand those things, not whether the system is racist or not, whether disability exists or not in African-American communities or Latinx communities. It's a broader sociological and cultural question.
Love it. I love it. So I want to, last question before I open it up to our audience. So if you're an audience and you want to ask a question, please put that question, in the Q&A feature, and I'll get to it. Last question before we open it up to the audience. I have a question, right? So far we've been talking about how, race, matters in disability justice. Now I want to change the conversation, right? I want to talk about how disability matters to questions of racial justice. Like, what can we learn, right? How can racial equity work become more ability sensitive, such as through the revision and elimination of ableist idiomatic terms. More commonly, racial equity scholarship is used, such as colorblind, which Subini has taught us, so evocatively to move into color evasiveness. Instead, we still use terms, and I heard it today on the news, tone deaf, crippling, paralyzing, and others are too numerous to list here. So what can racial equity work, learn from? How can it benefit from, more ability sensitive, disability just work?
Go ahead, Alfredo, you can take this one first.
Yeah. I struggle with the question because I think both narratives, racial and disability justice, have acknowledged, especially in the last 30 years, the blind spots and the areas in which we need to see more development, particularly around intersectionality. And so implicit in the question of addressing this issue is the assumption that we maintain that essential assumption about the disabled body or the racialized body. And I think what we need to do is to move into processes of understanding the othering mechanisms that we have in place and to begin to bring a discourse of intersectionality. But there is a risk in using intersectionality because I see many folks using intersectionality as if it's a trait of the individual. So somehow we might run the risk of returning to that individualistic perspective. And there is a dimension in intersectionality that acknowledges that individual aspect. But intersectionality is not only about identity silos or labels or categories that we need to acknowledge: race, gender, class, etc., ability. But intersectionality has to be placed in a broader institutional structural setting. I mean, Crankshaw's original work told us that has to be placed in that structural dimension to understand how it's played out. So in thinking about how each of those two discourses on justice related to race and disability can benefit each other, we need to place it in that broader canvas of understanding and how they fit in interlocking ways, and as well in terms of the structural aspects in which we make sense of it. So that's the beginning of an answer for that, David.
I mean, I would just build on Alfredo's comments in a couple of ways. Number one, I love our naming of what is intersectionality, because I think it is one of those terms like identity politics that is becoming so misused. And Kimberly Crenshaw's original articulation of it was really about interlocking subordinations, interlocking oppressions, It was not about multiple identities. It was about interlocking oppressions. So she was talking about racism, sexism, right? We're talking about racism, ableism, and how they're interlocking, how you cannot have one without the other. And that's different than talking about race and disability. Those are identities. Those are socially constructed categories. Racism and ableism are the oppressions that have been applied to those socially constructed categories. So we have to be able to name the difference. So I now say multiple identities. I don't say intersectional identities because I find it confusing. And I think it's how we are starting to misuse. And that is how what Alfredo was talking about, it gets super individualized, right? And what Crenshaw is also talking about with intersecting oppressions is how those are systemic. Those are built into our systems. So if we recognize that, I think that gets us really far. I think the other thing for me is always remembering that the ways that racial justice can learn from disability studies and critical disability perspectives and disability justice work is that we center the multiply marginalized. That instead of the cis hetero male being the center of our work, we actually think about disabled folks on the margins. We think about queer folks on the margins. We think about trans and non-binary folks on the margins, and we move them into the center. And how different would our organizing be if we actually move those kids, not individually, but as groups, into the center of our work? What would happen if disability, so special education and disability work actually centered disabled kids of color, disabled Black kids, the kids who are most marginalized, who are at the margins of even the oppressed groups? That to me is what this brings. And it changes the narrative. And this is what I keep hitting upon this because it changes the narrative of how we even talk about, like I say a lot of times, like a lot of my audience is to critical race theorists, it's to hip hop pedagogues, it's to all these folks, anti-racist folks, abolition folks, who are bringing such a hardcore, thoughtful analysis around race, but we are in racism and missing ableism and how we can actually have that conversation. So one of the things I want us to think about is if we took those kids and put them at the center. So if we put those kids at the center, that would change the way we designed our classrooms, or even our critical social justice-based classrooms. That would change the way that we created access to those classrooms. That would change the way we thought about it. That would change the way disability work works. So it's just, to me, that would shift so much. And, you know, like I talk about this, I say this in a lot of talks. So if you listen to me speak recently, I'm sorry if you've heard this before, but like a great example I always think of is Fannie Lou Hamer, right? Fannie Lou Hamer is considered like one of the mothers of the civil rights movements. Her ideas and thoughts are talked about a lot in anti-racist work and abolitionist work and social justice work, right? Fannie Lou Hamer was a Black woman, right? So that's really important to name. But she was also, she had a limp because she had polio as a child. So she had a disability her whole life. But then she also experienced a forced hysterectomy that were so common in the 1950s, it was called a Mississippi appendectomy. Then she was also beaten severely in a Mississippi jail. So she had multiple things happen to her. And that is one of the things we have to be able to talk about is Black folks, even if you're not born with the disability, you are likely to acquire one just from resisting systemic oppression. So, but when we talk about Fannie Lou Hamer in the classroom, do we talk about her disabilities? Are we open and honest about those? Or do we kind of hide and not name or ignore? So a couple of months ago, Valissa Thompson, who's an activist, myself and Ayanna Presley, who's the representative of Massachusetts, wrote an op-ed about Black disabled girls and how they are actually being targeted for their disabilities. Because one of the things we see is how whiteness works for disability can protect white kids. I honestly think that the way special ed has always been set up has been set up to protect white children with disabilities. Now, that doesn't mean it does so perfectly. It doesn't do great by white children either, but it really harms Black and brown children. And so we wrote this piece arguing we can't ignore Black girls' disabilities when they're part of the story. So that's again what I mean by centering the multiply marginalized. If we did that, I think that's what racial justice could learn from disability studies work, and disability justice could also learn from racial justice work.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
A couple of additional points I wanted to mention briefly, David, if I may, or are we out of time?
Please, we're open. Yeah.
So as I think about the way we engage with intersectionality and multiple marginalizations, we have to remember that the attention to the circumstances of individuals living in those conditions have to be situated, because intersectionality changes depending on situations, and certain dimensions of our identities will change. I'm thinking about a class action suit a few years ago that emerged as a result of an immigrant, an undocumented immigrant who had an intellectual disability, who was also considered an English learner. Right there, you have 3, if not 4 different vectors of identity. And because of the way the institution was organized, he could not have access to legal representation because of the immigration status. And then there was no accommodations for his disabilities. And there was no interpretation services for his lack of English proficiency and so forth. So you see that in certain points in his life, the issue of language played a very different role than when he was detained for 4 or 5 years without any representation, languishing in that situation. So to me, the reminder is intersectionality is not static, it's not fixed just because I am a Latino man of a particular social class and sexual orientation. Each of those vectors are going to be playing different roles and have greater or less importance depending on situations in which I'm situated, at school, at home, in the community. And that's something that we need to keep in mind, that this is a very dynamic notion.
Yeah.
And the other one is, as we work for inclusion and think about including, we also have to bring that critical set of questions about inclusion into what, and what are the kinds of things. So that means feeling comfortable in living in this liminal space in which you are trying to be included in the center in some mainstream kinds of things, while at the same time you want to bring a transformative bent to whatever you're trying to do when you are in that space.
I love it. I love it. Dr. Fabienne Doucet and I, we have a piece coming out, on adolescent development. And we're using this concept of transsectionality, the idea that intersections are moving, are as in motion, as the systems and the individuals that occupy, our world. So thank you for that contribution. I'm going to turn to the questions of, our, audience. Catherine Hoy, and forgive me if I butcher your name, please charge it to the head, not to the heart. She says that I am an educational advocate. I work for one of the largest disability service providers in the country. And she asks, can we talk about a vision of education for students with disabilities? What must change about IDA? What must change about IDA? And for those, the IDA is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act.
Alfredo, go ahead.
Right. Many things. I think the underlying assumptions about equity have to be revisited. IDEA has relied largely on notions and assumptions about equity in terms of access. A few years ago, that changed a little bit when the attention to outcomes was built in, starting with NCLB. However, the way we're thinking about outcomes has tended to be fairly narrow. There are some considerations to adapt, especially for students who have more intense kinds of needs and disabilities to gauge the outcomes. But I think we need to be thinking more broadly about learning and outcomes for students with disabilities in the law. The issue of race and disability and how it's monitored through those indicators, 4, 10, and 9, tends to be disruptive. It tends to reify compliance mindset. We've finished a study recently in the Northeast where administrators said we have been chronically cited for disproportionality. And there is something terribly wrong with that system, this person said, because We can actually go through the audit of this from the state, making us consider our procedures and policies, and we can pass the audit without changing much in the system. So this compliance mindset is something that is critical, that we need to be rethinking, and how we can bring interventions to at the district level, at school level, to engage more deeply into changing practices at the root level. And David, you have leading this work for over 10 years now through the Metro Center. You can speak to this as well, and you know very well the challenges in making a dent with this kind of work. But this idea of equity and how it's framed and how it's examined is critical. And so let me stop there, but I think I mentioned 3 or 4 things that come to mind in terms of IDEA.
Mm-hmm. Subini, anything?
I would not, the only thing I would add to that is, I mean, policy in law is not going to get us free, right? In the sense of, but I think Alfredo's point about a compliance mindset is so important. Like, we have to do more than what the law sets out to do. But the one thing I will say is, man, could we just get some data collection that actually captures multiple identities? Because that to me is just, it just seems so obvious, and yet it's not there. So maybe we know race, disability, gender. Do we know sexuality? Do we know documented status? Like, there's so many things that go on. And really, I think if we actually captured multiple identities in data collection, and those demographic data collection, I think we would actually see that who is being, again, pushed into those segregated classrooms, who is being labeled, who is pushed into segregated classrooms, and who is being pushed out of schools are, again, kids with multiple labels and identities, instead of just the narrow ones that we actually collect.
There are some interesting built-in barriers in the current structure of IDEA that are also creating a lot of problems for people in the field. One is visions of accountability. And there are some interesting contradictions between, for example, the standards movement, you know, the notion of standards for students with disabilities. Well, finally, we can ask, beyond placing students and having an IEP, can we have standards to make sure that the system is accountable for the learning of these kids? But implicit in the idea of standards is the assumption that we need to treat everybody in a standard way. In contrast to the assumptions built into the individualized educational program that requires individualization. So how do we live in a system that calls you to be paying attention to the individual, while at the same time you abide by standards that apply equally to all? That's a terrible nightmare that needs to be examined, that has been debated for a number of years now, but it's critical that we actually pay attention to it.
Yes. I think you know, I think about IDEA, you know, in the ways that it exists as color evasive, you know, to use Subini's language. You know, I dream of, you know, federal policy, you know, that can name our names, that can actually name race and name gender, you know, and be specific about what is needed in order to support, you know, our babies across difference. Jules asks, and Jules works for, you know, NYU Metro Center. She's part of the ASD Nest, you know, project at NYU Metro Center. Amazing. The question just disappeared. Oh, no, it didn't. It moved off my screen. So Jules asks, you know, Dr. Annamma, in pedagogy of pathologization, you identified yourself as an abolitionist, and you referenced today too. I also know you've with Dave, I think she means you've worked with Dave Stovall, who writes about school abolition for those unfamiliar. She says, I can't wrap my head around how schools could ever not cause harm, perpetuate oppression, especially under capitalism. What are your plural thoughts? And she gives some context. I was part of a school abolitionist ITAG where we ultimately discuss abolitionist reforms versus reformist reforms. I've read about harm reduction pedagogy, and I continue to dive into your pedagogies of resistance with pre-service educators while I remain in educational spaces. Again, her question is, you know, I can't wrap my head around how schools could ever not cause harm, perpetuate oppression, especially under capitalism. What are your thoughts?
Ooh, that's a lot. That's a thoughtful question. I'm going to try to give you a few thoughts, Jules, and then maybe we'll have to talk offline after this. But, you know, first of all, I joke that I'm like a baby abolitionist. Like I'm still learning about abolition. And part of that is because, like many people, I grew up in this society, which is really rooted in punishment. And so I'm still learning to get that punishment mentality out of my head, because there are certain things when certain people happen that I would like to see them punished. Let's talk about January 6th, you know, like I would like to see certain things happen, but I also know that that isn't going to bring justice to the system. And so I am learning from folks like Mariama Kaba, K-A-B-A. I am learning from folks like, you know, I'm learning from abolitionists about how to think through this. So first of all, I want to be clear about that. I don't think it's like my expertise, like, but I'm still learning about it, and I'm still claiming it while I'm learning about it. I think we can do both at the same time. I think schools, I think we need to rethink schooling. I think the way schools are set up, where we have kids sitting for 9-10 hours a day, barely getting any kind of movement, taking standardized tests that we know don't work. I mean, our system is broken, right? And we have to rethink a bunch of these things. And I think we have to be moving towards a more just system while we're tinkering with the system we're in, because we can't get out of the system we're in. Like we can't burn it all down right at this moment. Like I want us to rethink how to rebuild, you know, and we have to fix what's happening in the moment. So, you know, and I always give the example, like I work in youth prisons, I work with incarcerated kids. That's what that book is about that Jules mentioned. So thank you for mentioning my book. And I also, and I'm working to close youth prisons down at the same time. Did I freeze?
You did.
Can you still hear me at least?
I can hear you.
Sorry, you're gonna have to look. Okay, you're just gonna have to look at that face. Just look away. But yeah, you know, so I think that's the thing we have to hold on to, is that, you know, like some people believe if you're an abolitionist, then you can't work in prisons, but they're still incarcerated kids. So I'm not gonna leave them to languish while I try to get these systems removed. So I think that's how we have to be able to think of both and in these situations. How do we dream of better schools and dream about better and start arguing for and tearing down of, while still being in schools with kids, trying to reduce the harm they cause, trying to increase the good they do. So I think, I don't know if that really answers your questions, Jules, but I just think it's a both and situation. These schools are currently, they reproduce systemic inequities, they harm kids. That doesn't mean they harm all kids, but I don't think even the kids who go on and have great success in schools aren't necessarily like getting a lot of benefit from the schools themselves, right? Most of us who've done really well have parents who've done really well, right? Like it's so much related to your parents' educational background, your parents' level of wealth. Like, let's be honest about what schools do right now. They reproduce. But that doesn't mean we can't keep dreaming. And that's the thing I also want to point out. I'll end, but like Mariama Kaba, that same person, also talks about how you don't possess hope, you practice it every day. And that has really shifted the way I understand the world, because when I get hopeless, then I have to think about what I can do. And I have to look in my sphere of influence. So one of the things I really encourage us who are thinking about abolition is look around what's already being done in your neighborhood, what's already being done locally with something you know about. You don't have to go learn a whole new thing. You don't have to go march in the streets if that is not your ministry. I just still think we don't have to push ourselves into these places we don't belong. I think we can actually just go and learn what other people are doing. And we start at the back of the room, not the front. And what I mean by that is we start by listening to what is already being done. Because as soon as you identify something that is an injustice, you will find somebody who's already working on it. So figure out how to do that, be in community with people, and practice hope.
I love that. I love that. Attendee, an anonymous attendee, you know, points out what seems to be a gap in our conversation. And they ask, where do students with hidden disabilities stand? For example, type 1 diabetics, where they are not necessarily all placed in special education classes or classified with either the disability group or the normal group of students. How does one advocate for them?
You know, oftentimes you see students in those circumstances being grouped under other health impairments. And you have the category that presumably is going to give them entitlements and rights and access to resources. When you add the intersectionality lens, then you have, for example, discussions about the growing epidemic of diabetes and obesity in Latinx communities. That is all over the map in certain circles, but not connected to special education discussions. The fact that you have a higher rate of those conditions in that community is never connected to the fact that Latinx as a group is not disproportionately placed in special education at the national level. It's not a convenient fact for some of the people that are pushing for that narrative. So I think, how do we advocate for them? I think we need to raise awareness. We need to find ways in which we can denounce that there are systemic racist systems in place that are maintaining and producing those conditions oftentimes, and engage in conversations with the communities to really dispel a lot of the misunderstandings that may be around those conditions so that they can really be more open and active in the discussions about policy and practices.
Subini.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would add, of course, Alfredo's on point, is that this is the issue with IDEA having these 13 categories. And if you don't fall into them, you might fall into OHI, or you might fall under 504, or you might not get any support at all. And again, it's why we have to look at people with multiple disabilities that's broader than just this narrow category of what falls under IDEA, because PTSD, some of these things are not getting caught, or they're being labeled as generalized emotional disabilities. An example is when I did a study with girls of color in a college town, where we looked at their discipline disparities, because they were there too. Also noting it's not just an urban problem, right? It happens wherever Black kids exist. But one of the Black girls told us that she was diabetic and she had permission to miss class to go get food, and how often she got punished for that her teachers didn't care that she had that right, that folks did not honor that. So I think this question is really, really important, because it gets at, again, these narrow categories of who fits into these categories, who can claim which identity, and who is left out and not being considered. So again, that's where we center the multiply marginalized, how they identify themselves, but also groups of people to better understand how to serve them.
I think we need to disrupt the assumption that interventions are always a benign gesture to these students and these communities, that we also need to be, I think both of you, David and Subini, have mentioned this a few times, as well as myself. We need to be attentive to the consequences. What comes after we presumably acknowledge the existence of those challenges, and how do we provide opportunities for these learners to advance their educational careers? I mean, I'm thinking, I've been reading Larry P., the case from the 70s, and after Larry P. was diagnosed with intellectual disability, he was told that he needed to show up at a supermarket every morning, 7 in the morning, for 4 or 5 hours every day as part of his educational program. By the time he hit senior year, he didn't have enough credits to graduate from high school, even though he was supposed to be involved throughout the day in doing these things. So at the time, there was a big fight to designate this young man as having a disability, presumably to provide the services he needed. And in the end, look at what happened in the name of providing educational services for his needs.
Love it. I love that. I'm going to ask one more question, but I want to quickly address, some of the other questions that are in the chat, because I think they can be answered quickly and by me. One anonymous attendee, wants to know if we can share references. And we'll make sure that we share as many other references or things that were referenced today. Reach out to Paloma Garcia at NYU Metro Center, and we'll get those references to you. And we'll also try to mail to registrants, email to registrants, as many of the resources as we possibly can, as a follow-up. There's another question, that's talking about, the divide between theory and practice that Subini, pointed out. The question is, how can K-12 teachers embody abolitionist practices while also existing and serving in an ableist, racist, and discriminatory system at the classroom level? I think that takes a little bit more conversation, but I would argue, or at least ask, that you read Bettina Love's We Want to Do More Than Survive. I think she gives and offers some really good, suggestions to that question. There's another question here, that's asking about, is it a good idea to teach the history of disabled people, to our students in schools? Yes, yes, and yes, and more yes. But do it from a critical space that does not reinforce, kind of racist narratives, gendered narratives, and some other things. Do you two want to speak to any of those questions before I move to the last question?
I'll just say at the classroom level, we wrote a piece called Discrete Classroom Ecology, where we take the stuff that we had started in the book that Jules mentioned, this pedagogy of resistance, and we moved it into this narration of discrete classroom ecology. And it was based on this idea that W.E.B. Du Bois, and if you haven't read Du Bois's work, I highly suggest it, had written this piece called, had written about what this thing called, what Raylan Rabaka calls gift theory. And gift theory is this idea that multiply marginalized people, he was talking about Black people in specific, so let me be clear. He was saying Black folks understand the world better because they have to understand both how it is to be oppressed, but they also have to understand how white folks see the world and how white folks see them. So what he was saying is that they have gifts, that because of this oppression, they have gifts that that white folks don't have. So we took that idea and brought it into the classroom. What if teachers admitted that their students of color, their Black students and their students of color, especially their multiply marginalized one, had gifts that we don't have, and that they have things to teach us? And that does not mean by superficially making them pretending that they are the teachers and putting the load on them, but it's really understanding how we have to centralize them. And it talks about these three ideas of pedagogy, curriculum, and solidarity as relationships. So that would be one example. I totally agree with David that Bettina Love's work, there's lots of people thinking this through, but that's one that's thinking about from a discrete standpoint.
Thank you. So last question, and I know a couple others just popped up, and what we'll do is we'll try to answer the other two, via email, since we're short on time today. Last question comes from Lydia Ocasio-Stottenberg, and she writes, and I believe it's they write, excuse me, and apologize if there is any misgendering. They write. As a Black and Latinx mother of a child with Down syndrome diagnosis, I can say this experience of inequity happens even before we even set foot in schools. How can we address all practitioners of care? As parents, we are inside and outside of schools. We need therapists, communities, and healthcare providers to see and value our children. So can we answer her question? How can we address all practitioners of care?
Go ahead, Alfredo.
This is such a profound question. It speaks to institutional cultures and how institutional cultures that tend to be fairly homogeneous, social class-wise and racial background-wise, regard communities of color, irrespective of your education level as a parent of color or race. You're going to have a different experience. And I'm thinking about the work that was done in the 90s about how parents socialize their kids to engage with stakeholders. And the scene is of a mother who is walking to the pediatrician's clinic, white mother telling the kid 2 minutes before they go into the clinic, be ready to ask questions of the doctor. This is a young kid that is being told you are entitled to address and question the person that is serving you, even though this person is an adult. And then she contrast of an African-American mother from a lower social class that's walking to the clinic and is saying, don't even dare to open your mouth when you are in that clinic, unless you're spoken to. You have to be respectful. And the point is how each of them create different contexts for interacting and getting access to resources, in this case, information, in very different ways. On top of that, you have institutions that have a very deficit perspective on families of color, unfortunately. Whether you are accomplished or not as a parent, that shouldn't be or shouldn't matter. So I think multiple fronts in addressing this. I just pointed the two broad limits of the spectrum, but I think we need to put pressure on institutions to have leadership instill a culture of respect for families of color, of honoring the dignity they are owed, and engaged in the same way that they are addressing parents of white middle-class backgrounds. And then we need to also work with families and communities to make sure that we make those things visible and build counter narratives to the images that these professionals may have sometimes about us.
Yeah, I would add, I mean, so what Alfredo is describing, and I know he's thinking this, but I just want to say it out loud. What he's pointing out is not that these mothers are doing something wrong, that the Black mother is doing something wrong and the white mother is doing something right. The Black mother is doing something that's protective of her child, because she knows that if her child starts asking questions, then she and her child could be seen as disrespectful and wouldn't get the services they need. So first, I just want to show that if the comparison of the two behaviors is not to say this one's doing it wrong and this one's doing it right. And I know that's what Alfredo was pointing out. So I just want to point that out. And really what you're seeing right there is a system that enables. And I want to start talking about this. We debilitate some children and we enable other children. And we write about this in a piece in Teachers College Record, where we talk about how Black girls and girls of color talk about the different ways even when they're following directions, when they raise their hand in class, the different ways they are debilitated. And what I mean by that is access is foreclosed for them. So when they raise their hand in class, the three things they say happen to them are adverse responses, where they are ignored, they are told to try harder, or they are made fun of by their teachers, doing exactly what they're supposed to be doing. Meanwhile, they're noticing that white children don't even raise their hand and are encouraged to answer and are given support and are given strong teaching skills. So again, that's an enabling of certain kids while we're debilitating other kids. So first, I just want to point that out. Real quickly, I just want to note that, again, sometimes it can seem like we're putting all the responsibility on teachers, but just like education reproduces societal inequities, so does the legal system, so does the medical system, so does social work, so does psychology. So when Lydia is asking this really great question, it's that we need to bring these perspectives into multiple fields. It certainly isn't just education. Now, I put a lot of responsibility, first of all, for education on teacher education, not on teachers, on teacher ed. We are the ones failing. We have to look at teacher ed to find out what the source is of so many teachers who are not capable of teaching Black and brown students. So I think that's number one. And number two, we have to think about how to bring these ideas into other fields, because education is certainly not the only field doing this. So Lydia, I think that's a great question. And I hope that you are feeling supported as a parent with a child with Down syndrome.
Thank you both so much. We're kind of at our time. So I just want to thank you two again. I'm so full. I'm so full. Thank you, for an amazing colleague. I also want to personally thank, my colleague and Chief of Staff, Paloma Garcia, for helping to make today's event possible. I also want to thank Marina, and Glashanda, for their interpretation, and the wonderful, wonderful audience. I want to thank the community in this space for the time and commitment and for your questions. For we know a requirement of activism is to find ways to support intersectional forms of resistance, because a valuing of multi-dimensional identities and a troubling of singular notions of identity such as race or disability or class or gender or sexuality and so on starts with the fundamental understanding that the American project has and remains actively engaged in efforts to mark bodies as race, to perpetuate the predominance of whiteness and the privileges associated with it, and that this normalized notion of whiteness also embodies an inherent confluence of physical and cognitive normalcy or ability, right? In the construction and perpetuation of a mythical, good, acceptable, and whole person. Now, with that said, and as we seek to center disability justice, from a anti-racist racial equity perspective, which is necessary if we are to achieve justice writ large, let's also, center everything that was mentioned today, so that we might forge refuge from the gaze of white supremacy and ability supremacy, where our children dream weightless, unracialized, and human, where language flows freely and exists as nurtured resistance is both breath, where the educational imagination dances wildly into the night, quenching the thirst and yearning and giving birth to becoming. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you with love. Have a great day. Bye.
Take care. Thanks, David.